Hello, dear friends. These are some words on Parshat Hukat. And I call this the original land dispute of the Israelites and the Ammonites. And I would like to discuss this. Now, when Israel is going through the desert, during those 40 years with Moses, so they come to the lands of Edom. And Edom says, and they request to go through to make it a shorter distance. And Edom says, you shall not go through my land, because if you go through your land, my land, I will attack you. And they want to go through the lands of Moab, and the Moabites also said, you shall not go through my land or I'll attack you. And then God told them to attack Sikhon, the king of Emori. And but first, of course, they asked to go through the land of Sikhon, and he said no. And Sikhon first brought out his army and was about to attack Israel, and then Israel was allowed to attack Sikhon, and they were victorious over Sikhon, the king of the Amorites. And it says here in chapter 21, it says here, Vayakehu Yisrael eficharev. The Israelites smote him by the sword. Vayirash et artzo, then they inherited his land from the Arnon River till the Abuk River until the boundaries of Ammon, because the city of Uz is the boundary of Ammon. Now, what does that mean? Well, it turns out that Sikhon originally had conquered some of the land of Ammon. And this land, let me show it to you in map just to get the idea. So you can see in this map, can make it slightly larger, I think. So in this map, you see here basically the land of Israel during the time of Yiftach, which we'll talk about in a moment, which is in the Haftorah. So you can see the Abuk River to the north, and further down, there is the Arnon River in the south. Arnon all the way to the Abuk. Here's now the border with Ammon. All this area originally was conquered by Sikhon, the king of the Amorites. When Israel came from the south and conquered Sikhon, de facto, they had taken land that previously, I even think even before Sikhon, one of the Amorite kings had conquered from Ammon. Yeah, that is the story which is told here in Hukat. Now, in the Haftarah, in the prophets that we read this week, we read from the book of Shoftim, the book of Judges, chapter 11, the story of Yiftach. And in the story, we have the first, I would say, story in our history of a dispute over land, over territory in the Israelite kingdom. Of course, this was before a king, so I'd have to say the Israelite sovereignty. And the story goes that Yiftach was from the Gilad, and he was a great warrior. And his brethren come to him and say, look, Ammon is fighting against the children of Israel, and we want you to be our leader in order to fight them, because we know you're a warrior. Yiftach says, well, hey, you guys hated me. All of a sudden you want me to be your warrior? So no, we need you now, and we need you to fight. So as Ammon, of course, is fighting Israel, Yiftach then sends a letter through a messenger. And the letter that he sends to Ammon, which is just on the other side of the border, is Mali Valach. What is the point? Why are we fighting? Why did you come to fight me? What's the reason? Explain to me. I'm a new leader. Tell me the reason. So the king of Ammon sends this messenger back to Yiftach and tell him, Ki kach Yisrael et artzi. The Israelites took out my land when they left Egypt, the land from the northern river, the southern river of the Arnon, till the northern river of the Yabok, and all the way to the Jordan River. Ve'ata hashiva eten b'shalom. And therefore, you give me back them, and I will give you peace. Okay, this is the original land for peace deal. You took my land, and give me back my land, and I will give you peace. Now, let me again show you just a picture to refresh your memories. So you have here, so the king of Ammon says that this land, from the Arnon in the south, all the way to the Yabok here in the north, and from the Jordan River over here in the Jordan Valley, going to what at that time was Ammon with their capital, capital in Rabbah, right? So all of this land, they went back. So what does Yiftach say to them? And to make this a little bit easier, I will show you the source of these. So this source, of course, is from the book of Kings, chapter 11. And it starts the Haftorah from verse 1, but we'll take it from where we just left off, which is from verse 14. And Yiftach sent messengers to the king of the children of Ammon. Of course, remember, Ammon said, Israel took away my land when he came out of Egypt from the Arnon River in the south until the Yabok River, and going up and down north to south, the Jordan River, and therefore restore the cities peacefully, land for peace. And Yiftach sent messengers again to the king of Ammon, and he said to them, thus says Yiftach, Israel did not take any land from Moab or from the children of Ammon, right? Ammon and Moab are sister nations. Other nations, if you remember the story of the daughters of Lot, who bore one son Ammon, one son Moab, in the book of Bereshit in Genesis. And when the Israelites came up from Egypt and went through the wilderness and into the Red Sea and came to Kadesh, and then Israel sent messengers to the king of Edom, like it says in this week's Parsha. He said, don't go through, and God didn't let us go through either. And then we walked through the wilderness and we came to the land of Moab. And then we pitched on the other side of Arnon, but we never went through the borders of Moab, as it says in this week's Parsha, because the Arnon River already at that time was the border of Moab and not the northern Yabok River, because it was captured by the Amorite kings before, as it says in this week's Parsha. And Israel sent messengers to Sikhon, the king of the Amorites, and said, let us pass peacefully through your place. But Sikhon trusted not Israel, and he gathered his army together and fought against Israel, and God delivered Sikhon and all his people into the hand of Israel and smote them. So Israel possessed all the land of the Amorites. And they possessed the border of the Amorites from the Arnon until the Yabok, which means when Israel conquered Sikhon, the king of the Amorites, de facto, this land became part of Israel too, because it previously already was under the sovereignty of Sikhon, the king of the Amorites. So Israel de facto never fought Ammon and never took land from Ammon. This was land that had previously lost in an early battle. So the first argument he's saying is a historical argument. We never actually fought you. We never took land from you. And so get the narrative right. The land that maybe previously had once belonged to Ammon was lost in a battle to the Amorites way before we came. And when we conquered the Amorites after they fought us, so they became part of us, but we never took it from Ammon. Then the second argument, he says, is what I would call a legal argument. So now the Lord, the God of Israel, has dispossessed the Amorites from before his people Israel, and now you should possess them? Would you not possess that which Chemosh, your God, gave you to possess, meaning if you were victorious in battle? So too, the God of Israel has also made us victorious, and therefore we can possess it. After all, when you go out to battle, in the name of your God Chemosh, and when you're victorious, you say your God Chemosh gave you this land, it's now legitimately yours. So if we won a battle against Sikhon, and in the name of our God, wouldn't it be the same thing that it's ours? Because that's the way your law works. It should be then the same for us. So this is now a legal argument, which in those days was a religious and legal argument simultaneously. Now, the next argument that he's going to use is argument of what I call, say in Hebrew, is hityashnut, meaning a lot of time has gone by, and therefore your ability then to argue it is not good. Verse 26. In Israel dwelt in Heshbon, and in these towns, and in the city of Aroer and all its towns. We've been dwelling there for 300 years since we left Egypt. Where were you all this time? Why didn't you try to recover them before? We've been there for 300 years. Where you been for 300 years? So if you didn't argue for 300 years that it's yours, hey, that means that de facto you're admitting that it's ours. And then the last argument, so you have the first argument is historical narrative, that it's not according to what you're saying. Second argument is a legal, religious argument. And the third argument basically is what we say, time is up. In most legal systems, if you wait too long, it means that basically you've accepted the new scenario. And then, of course, he says, and why would you want to fight us? Don't you remember Balak, the son of Zippor, was the king of Moab, and he tried to fight us and lost in battle? So why are you wasting your time? And I have not sinned against you. You're doing wrong to me. May God be the judge. You are now creating an aggravation. You are now creating provocation against us. And therefore, this is the way we see it. So forget about the land for peace. Let's all go home. The Ammonites did not hearken to the words of Yiftach, and the Spirit of God was upon him, and he passed over the Gilad Manasseh, passed over Gilad, etc., and he fought the Ammonites. Now, there are two things here that I'd like to point out, which I think also is very important in this story. Point number one that I'd like to point out is that even though that Yiftach knows that Ammon has already been battling Israel, and the chances of them stopping just because of his arguments, which are sound arguments, are not very high. But it's important, if you feel justified in your position, to state it publicly. State your narrative, let other people hear it. Because wars are not just about battles, it's also about narratives. And people have to hear your side, because there are a lot of bystanders, especially today. There's media and there's international press and there's internet, etc. So let your narrative be known and let them know that there's another side, and let them know that Ammon is not the only narrative in this story. That's an important point, I think, up to this day. And number two, notice that Yiftach doesn't say, let's compromise. You want land for peace? We'll give you half, take half. No, if you think that somebody is wrong, you don't compromise. And that's exactly what is happening, because no country gives away sovereign land voluntarily. If they're forced to, that might be another thing in a war. That's usually what happens in the world political agenda. There's a war and land is lost. They're trying to change that since the Second World War, but that's the way the ancient world always worked. But nobody would voluntarily compromise, especially when basically you're talking about a malevolent act of the Ammonites, who have provoked this whole story based on some historical thing from 300 years back that they never bothered to talk about. So it's very interesting to see how these political discussions are taking place between Yiftach and the Ammonites. And it's almost like history repeats itself. This was 300 years after leaving Egypt, and now thousands of years later, there are a lot of similar things in the exact same geographical area of the state of Israel today. So maybe there is something to learn from Yiftach. Shalom, shalom.